And welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist, and we are seeing the result of an intense sell-off today on Wall Street. It happened amid mixed messages from the Trump administration about the prospects of a recession and growing fears of an escalating trade war between the U.S. and its top economic partners. The Dow today at one point tumbling more than 1,000 points and finishing the session down roughly 900 points. You see there, that's a drop of about 2%. The losses were even worse across the other major indices, especially the tech-heavy NASDAQ. That lost roughly 4% of its value today. Now, that slide only adding to the rough stretch for investors after stocks fell across the board last week as well. Let's get right to CNBC senior markets correspondent Bob Pisani. Bob, you've been tracking this all day. Help us understand exactly what happened today.
Well, Aaron, the S&P closed off the low. The S&P 500 is the main gauge that the stock market watchers use, down 2.7%. We're now close to 9% off of the historic highs we hit a while ago. And as you mentioned, there's two concerns. Number one is tariffs. The stock market and investors believe tariffs are inflationary and they could be a drag on the economy. President Trump has said he disagrees with that, but that's what the market opinion is. The other problem that we're having is this is now morphing into broader concerns about a broader economic slowdown. This kind of thing affects consumer confidence, and eventually you start getting slower economic growth in general. Now, the problem is, Aaron, we don't know where the bottom is. If you start believing that there's going to be a broader economic slowdown or even a recession, the stock market could be gyrating for months now as analysts try to figure out exactly what's the earnings picture in the next few months. So this is creating a lot of uncertainty. The tariffs created uncertainty initially, and now there's some concerns about trying to figure out what kind of slowdown are we having right now.
Yeah, Bob, so for folks at home who are watching, help us understand some of what's potentially going to happen here, right? The idea of a bear market versus a bull market, a correction. What are we considering? What are we in for at this point?
The downturn so far is fairly garden variety, believe it or not. As I mentioned, we're almost 9% off of the recent highs. A correction is traditionally considered down 10%. We haven't had one in a while, but it wouldn't be surprising to have one eventually happen. If you want to ask, what do you need to do to sort of stop this? Well, what the market is trying to say right now, if you listen to what it's saying, is they want the tariffs to go away. That's very simple. President Trump could change a lot of this simply by moving on the tariffs and saying they're off the table. It seems, however, and the market is coming to believe that he does not want to do that right now, that for whatever reason, he feels that the negotiating positions he has are very important. So we may actually be stuck with tariff. If that's the case, everybody has to start adjusting some of their earnings expectations downward, because earnings is what really matters for the stock market, Aaron.
So then, Bob, what does conventional wisdom tell us about tomorrow, potentially? If the idea of tariffs are not going to go away, does the market continue to suffer as a result, or does it level off?
We had a really nice bounce today. I mean, we ended down, but we had definitely some trading coming in towards the close. The sense here is that there's been a lot of selling in the last few days. Volume has picked up. It's gotten heavier. So there may be what traders call a short-term tradable bottom. That is, I wouldn't be surprised if we open up tomorrow. The problem is the market can't figure out what kind of economic slowdown are we getting. And as long as that sits around, there's going to be uncertainty. And we're going to be subject to further declines until we be able to figure out exactly what's going on. And I know that's not a satisfying answer, but that really is the state of what we're doing.
No, I appreciate your expertise. Bob Pisani from CNBC for us today. Bob, thank you. Now, the market slide today coming after President Trump wouldn't rule out a recession during a Fox News interview that aired yesterday. Watch.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. That's a big thing. And there are always periods of, it takes a little time. It takes a little time. But I think it should be great for us. I mean, I think it should be great.
Now, the president was asked about those comments last night on Air Force One, and again would not rule out the prospect of some economic pain in the near term.
Are you worried about a recession? Maria Bartiromo asked you, and you kind of hesitated.
I'll tell you what, of course you hesitate. Who knows? All I know is this: we're going to take in hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs. and we're going to become so rich, you're not going to know where to spend all that money. I'm telling you, you just watch. We're going to have jobs. We're going to have open factories. It's going to be great.
Now, in a bit of a contrast to the president, his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, emphatically told Kristen Welker yesterday on Meet the Press that there will be no recession.
Mr. Secretary, consumer sentiment is dropping. Inflation has ticked up. Major banks like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs now say a recession in the next 12 months is becoming more likely. Should Americans brace for a recession?
Absolutely not. Anybody who bets against Donald Trump, it's like the same people who thought Donald Trump wasn't a winner a year ago. Donald Trump is a winner. He's going to win for the American people. That's just the way it's going to be. There's going to be no recession in America.
And this morning, one of the White House's top economic advisors told CNBC that he was bullish about the long-term prospects of the economy, while also trying to spin any near-term slowdown as the fault of the prior administration. Meanwhile, new retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. went into effect, including a 15% tariff by China on many U.S. agricultural goods, things like chicken, wheat, corn, cotton. There's also a 10% tariff on products like sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, and fish, as well as fruits and vegetables. Also today, the Canadian province of Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity that's coming into the U.S., affecting customers in several states. Now, these tensions between the U.S. and Canada escalating further after Canada's next prime minister addressed his nation with a defiant victory speech yesterday.
The Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. Think about it. If they succeeded, they would destroy our way of life. We didn't ask for this fight. The Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
Joining me now is NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, business and data reporter Brian Chung, and Jay Gray in Ottawa, Canada for us as well. Kelly, we'll start with you here. We just played President Trump hesitating to respond really about these concerns about a recession. Over the last week, we've heard him talk about his tariffs causing, quote, a little disturbance. Is there more concern behind the scenes here than Trump is letting on at all?
That is as far as the president has gone publicly, and we have not seen him yet today. And we hope there may be an opportunity if he were to open up a part of his schedule, and perhaps that would happen after the closing bell, to have a better sense of where the market reaction was today. It is not unusual for presidents, this one included, to not want to talk about hypotheticals. But at the same time, the president's policies are creating the uncertainty and the sort of roiling that is happening in the markets and on the world stage as other countries are assessing how they will respond. And it is ratcheting up tensions among friends like Canada and adversaries like China. It is unclear if the president is going to make any additional adjustments. We've already seen adjustments in tariff imposition based on conversations he's had with key leaders or with sectors of the economy. What comes next? Well, we expect that as of Wednesday, there will be additional tariffs on aluminum and steel at a rate of 25%. That will largely hit Canada again, where we get a lot of our imports on those matters. And so for now, the White House is really trying to talk up what a Trump economy will look like and giving a little bit of room for the transition period we're in. This is the 50th day the president's been in office. That's not a long time, but at the same time, he's done a lot of things that have injected uncertainty into the markets and the global relationships.
You're absolutely right on these global relationships. We know that China, as a matter of fact, announced retaliatory tariffs today on some U.S. goods that really target the agriculture sector here in America. Are there any indications at this point of how the president might respond to what China's done?
Well, in broad strokes, he has said that he would respond and match any tariffs that are imposed by other countries. And you're right, these really hit the heartland with the array of farm goods and products that are often sent by American farmers overseas China is a huge buyer of American soybeans, as one example, and that will have a real impact on farmers who need to plan for their crops, need to have a sense of their costs. Their margins aren't great to begin with, and so uncertainty for them can be the difference between a successful harvest, a successful season, or not. So there's a lot of questions there. And certainly in the heartland of America, if you look at the electoral map, there was a lot of Trump country involved there. So these things have real world consequences for Americans who are in business and in agriculture and in those sectors where our goods go out of the country and have long-standing relationships with other countries who are buyers. And the president, we do expect, based on what he has said, that he would respond in kind with any tariffs that come.
All right, we know you'll be watching closely. Kelly O'Donnell for us at the White House. Kelly, thank you. Let's turn to Brian Chung now. Brian, I want to play what the White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett said on CNBC a little bit earlier today. Watch this.
Just be very wary, Joe, of conversations about recession or not, given that we had 2 negative quarters. That used to be a recession under Biden, and then that wasn't a recession. I think that what's going to happen is the first quarter is going to squeak into the positive category, and then the second quarter is going to take off as everybody sees the reality of the tax cuts.
So, Brian, I know he's speaking your language. Does his logic make sense to you? Can tax cuts help to avert a recession?
Well, I mean, in theory, yes, but I want to point out that, first off, we are not in a recession right now. Right. The numbers do not point to that. We just got a jobs report last Friday that showed that the unemployment rate in this country is 4.1%, which is basically in line with what unemployment looked like in the final months of the Biden administration. And yes, it is indeed the case that some define a recession as 2 back-to-back quarters of negative GDP or a measure of economic activity, which we have not seen. We haven't even seen 1 quarter quite yet. But there are some initial readings from, for example, the Atlanta Fed, using more kind of high frequency data that we get on a weekly basis that say Q1 for 2025 could be negative. Again, we'll have to see once we get that final number in April or so. But look, when you talk about Wall Street, they are pricing in these concerns that these tariffs will lead to some level of uncertainty, which is indeed a drag on the economy. So yes, when we hear from Kevin Hassett saying, look, we could see 1 quarter of negative growth and then a bounce back, that could be in theory possible. But I do want to point out that, and I know that our White House team has been covering this pretty closely. The policy when it comes to tax cuts is not as clear as the tariff policy quite yet. So we're going to have to see the proof in the pudding and the text first before we evaluate whether or not that can account for GDP makeup there.
So on tariffs, we know that some of these new tariffs are in place right now. If we sort of forget about the guys in suits debating trade policy for a second, Brian, when will regular folks start to feel some of the effects of these tariffs, and what might that look like?
Well, Aaron, for the average person, I'm sure it's been nearly impossible to track exactly what happened in the last week. But yes, as you point out, there are tariffs that were put into place on Canada and Mexico, even despite some of the headlines over the exemptions for the automotive industry and for then those goods that are covered under the USMCA, that trade deal that the Trump administration negotiated in the first term. But things like, for example, the 10% tariff, it wasn't 25, 10% tariff on Canadian energy, that is something that the likes of Gas Buddy have warned could impact the prices that we see at the pump as soon as the middle of March, which is not that far away from now. That, when you also include these Chinese tariffs that took impact and took force just today, 10% on those types of agricultural products that you see ahead of you, 15% on other types of products as well. If you are a farmer here in the United States that is exporting to China, which is a major export market for things like soybeans, for things like pork, that is something that you're going to feel almost immediately. But again, I do want to point out that, some of the wide-ranging tariff threats that we've seen from the president, like on the campaign trail, 60% tariff that he's threatening on China. This is just the beginning of that, Aaron.
So one last thing I want to ask you. We know that Ontario just imposed this new 25% surcharge on electricity coming into the United States. Help us understand who exactly that is going to impact and how.
Yeah, this will be news to a lot of Americans who might not even be aware that in basically every state that's east of the Rockies, we have a grid that's plugged into the same energy grid that they use in Canada. However, what we heard from Doug Ford, who is the premier of Ontario, is that he's going to add that 25% surcharge to customers in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. These are 3 states that do use electricity from Ontario. I don't want to point out there are many other states in the union that also use Canadian power, but I want to point out that when it comes to the grids grids. We're pretty interconnected. It's possible in some cases that we could just kind of plug in the certain supply that we get to use it domestically to avoid those surcharges. I know that the regulator or a group of electricity providers in New York is asking for more clarity over exactly how these surcharges will be implemented, but it does threaten the possibility of electric bills in those states going up. But I do want to point out imports of Canadian electricity, according to the EIA, was only about $3.2 billion in 2023. That's not all that big when you compare it to other types of imports. And again, there might be ways that these states can hedge against those costs as well, Aaron. All right,
Brian Chung covering all the bases for us today. Brian, thank you. We appreciate it. Let's turn to NBC's Jay Gray now, who is reporting from Canada for us today. Jay, we know that there is a new prime minister coming in there. Tell us what you know about Mark Carney.
Yeah, Mark Carney, Aaron, is an economist. He served as the governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He's never held elective office. Carney calls his overwhelming victory last night in his run for Liberal head a mandate. He won with nearly 86% support from his party, and he says that's his mandate to move forward with the Liberal Party's platform, which is focused a lot on what's happening in Washington and the trade war. He'll likely be sworn in the next couple of days. Had a meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this morning at Parliament, and they discussed the logistics for Trudeau stepping down and him taking that post. He'll then turn around quickly, since he's not a member of Parliament, and call for an election, a federal election, where he will run to keep that post. Most believe it's going to be a contentious race. He is running against the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, who President Trump has said is more in line with his ideology and someone that he feels like he could work with a bit better.
But Carney seems to be the guy I know going in here, Jay. He had some strong words, which we don't typically say about Canadians, but he did have some strong words about President Trump and his comments about making Canada the 51st state and things like that. What do we know about how Carney might engage with President Trump going forward?
Well, he has said he's going to be direct. He says that one of his initial missions is to stand up to the president and what he calls threat to the actual freedom of Canada. I was at that convention last night. I can tell you that not only from Carney, but others at the podium and in the crowd, there was much more discussion about the tariff tug of war, about the trade war, about that suggestion from President Trump that the U.S. could absorb Canada as its 51st state. Then there were any discussions about problems in Canada or issues within Canada. So this country is highly focused on what's going on here, and it's become very nationalized. They are buying Canadian, boycotting American, and doing everything they can, they say, to send a message not only to the U.S., but the world.
And one of those messages, Jay, Brian and I just talked about, Ontario's electricity surcharge that we're seeing now. Are there any signs that other Canadian provinces are looking to impose any sort of price increases on exports to the U.S.?
Yeah, and let's just for review, remember that it's about 1.5 million American families right now in New York, Minnesota. It's families that are going to see maybe $100 boost in their monthly bill. So it's significant there. British Columbia in the process of passing legislation that would allow them to put a surcharge on energy that they send over to the U.S. and also allow them to restrict energy imports if they feel that's necessary. We know that there have been discussions with premiers in New Brunswick, Manitoba, Quebec, and Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith has referred to Canadian energy exports as, and I'm quoting here, a secret weapon and a trump card in the trade war between Canada and the U.S. So, yeah, that's an ongoing discussion. And again, I've been here for a few days. There is a real sense that this is a call to Canadians to stand up, and they are doing so. You said it earlier. They have earned Canadians a reputation internationally as being kind, as being generous, and at times reserved. But I think we're also quickly learning that when they feel like they're being bullied or pushed, that they're quick to